All right, so here we are talking about Chapter 1, Native Peoples and the Exploration of the Americas. On the first day of class, we talked a little bit about the peoples and their not the arrival of the Spanish so much, but more about the native peoples and how they got to the Americas, coming from Asia, Mongolia, and those places, and how they matriculated down into specific regions. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today mostly has to do with Spanish exploration, the arrival of Spanish explorers. The last part is going to deal with the British arrival in the Americas. So let's talk about Europe for a second. Europe is, of course, a country coming through a really long, difficult period of sickness and the Black Plague and the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. Now by the 1400s, so that's the time period we're talking about here. Let me just get the writing going here. So during the 1400s, we've got the Renaissance starting, the Renaissance period, rebirth and a revival in Europe. And what that sparks for Europeans is a growing sense of nationalism, right? Nationalism is, of course, great pride in your country, great pride in your people, okay? What happens in Europe is kingdoms start becoming nations. And as nations are formed, these groups that were tribes and small organizations of people really form into kingdoms and then ultimately into nations, particularly France, Spain, and England or Great Britain. So a great sense of nationalism exists throughout Europe. The other drive during this time is for commerce. One of the problems Europe has is it's one of the smaller continents. Of the 6 inhabited continents, the only one that's smaller in terms of size is Australia. So Europe has basically a space problem. There's not enough space for the people as the population continues to grow as a result of the post effects of the Black Plague, which killed about half the population, as much as half the population of Europe. Records aren't totally accurate on that. But in any event, we see massive population growth in Europe. And with this population growth, what that means is that you need resources, you need crops, you need land to build onto. You need lumber and timber to build these houses and build these structures for your population. Well, in Europe, there's not a whole lot of that. It's not really, much of Europe is not really great fertile ground for crops because of the weather conditions there are often cold in certain places. Not to mention, when you grow crops in the same place over and over again, the ground gets overused or over-tilled, and the nutrients get kind of used up, so you're not able to grow really good, strong crops, especially ones that really take a lot out of the ground. So they need to find new places to be able to do this. The only way to do that is ultimately through exploring new territories and areas to expand into, to build up commerce. There's that commerce word again. You want to build up commerce and work at expanding your population through those means. Now, the first to really command great success in terms of exploration would be the Portuguese, specifically a Portuguese prince named Henry the Navigator. I'm sorry, my handwriting's really bad, but whatever. So Prince Henry the Navigator, and he believes that it's really important to establish he believes it's really important to establish a trading route to India. He thinks the way to do this is to travel southward through the southern part of Africa and then back up to get to India. At this point, the world still believes that, or much of the world still believes, the European world, believes that the world is flat, that the earth is flat. Henry the Navigator wants to establish this trade route to get involved with the spice trade in India, and also look for new lands and places to expand into. Okay, so the Portuguese managed to do this. A guy by the name of Vasco da Gama establishes a trade route with India, and that leads for great success early for the Portuguese. They also ultimately make their way over to America, the Americas, and establish colonies that ultimately become Guyana, the nation of Guyana, as well as Brazil and Argentina. But that's not really relevant here. Of course, the person that really changes the face of exploration is Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus sails for Spain, and of course it's Spain that overtakes Portugal as the dominant country in terms of exploration. Columbus believes that the world is round, and he thinks that if he travels westward, he will be able to establish that way a trading route with India. Little does he know when he actually does this travel that he doesn't land in India, he lands in the Americas, a place that to this point had been unknown by Europeans that it even existed. In doing so, he adds validity to the idea that the world is indeed not flat and it is round. And of course, he becomes a great kind of hero to the people of Europe. Ironically for Columbus, he makes 4 voyages to the New World, or to the West Indies, as they're called, ultimately a great personal cost financially and otherwise, and he dies a very poor man in the early 1500s. So it's kind of a sad end to a person that's certainly a very significant historical figure. But the arrival of Columbus, of course, brings problems. Most notably, of course, is disease. And disease is not something that should be overlooked here. Disease decimates the populations of the people of the Native American people of these islands because they lack immunity to the diseases carried by Europeans that the Europeans had developed immunity to over the course of hundreds of years. In some places, on some islands, and other places in the Americas that the Spanish ultimately traveled to, as much as 85 to 90% of native populations are eradicated or killed off due to disease. So disease is a real problem here. Okay, but the arrival of Columbus and the immediate boom in westward expansion, particularly by the Spanish, makes Spain in the 1500s, the early 1500s, and through much of the century, the world's predominant power. Okay, because at this point in history, world power is derived from your ability to explore and establish trade routes with other places around the world. Here's a map of a lot of the different people that went to different places here. You have many of them, especially most of them down here being Spanish explorers, most of which are pretty bad people in terms of the things that they did to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Up here is kind of more British and Dutch explorers early on, some Italian explorers as well. So you have a lot of different people going to a lot of different places, discovering a part, so to speak, of North America, and further establishing themselves in these regions. Now, like I said before, the 16th century, remember, the name of the century is 100 years ahead of the years that we're in. Like, we're in the 21st century now, but it's the 2000s, right? We're in the 21st century now, but it's the 2000s. So the 16th century is the 1500s. And in the 1500s, the Spanish are the dominant world power, largely because of who become known as the conquistadors. The conquistadors were Spanish explorers who were particularly brutal in their efforts to, one, subjugate, meaning force themselves upon culturally and otherwise, and force into slavery or work the native peoples of these various places in which the Spanish are going, primarily in Central America, Mexico, places like that. Okay, most notable amongst these is Cortez. Hernando Cortez goes into Mexico and conquers the greatest empire rather quickly, the greatest empire in the Americas, which of course is the Aztecs. Um, the big advantage he has is they have guns, and the Aztecs don't use guns. They haven't developed gunpowder or the use of that yet. They also have wheels for wagons and things like that. And interestingly enough, as many advancements as the Native American tribes had made, the wheel was not one of them. So it's a big advantage there. Cortez rather easily, through advanced weapons, but most notably, of course, disease, again, decimates the native populations here, decimates the Aztec population, and becomes becomes extremely wealthy in acquiring all the gold and wealth that the Aztecs had, which was untold amounts of money, and gold and wealth. Other explorers like Pizarro in Peru, who conquers the Incas and gets loads and loads of silver, end up dominating that region. It's said that there was so much gold and silver acquired on some of these Spanish ships that they were so loaded with these precious metals, gold and silver, to be sent back to Spain, that some of the ships were so heavy with that stuff that they actually sunk in the Caribbean. So that's how wealthy the Spanish became very quickly in establishing their empire in the Americas. This was an empire early on that was established through brutality and greed. Greed to take gold and silver and other resources away from the native peoples of these regions. And of course, like I said before, brutal subjugation of the native peoples, forcing them into slavery, and if not slavery, then basically eradicating or killing the populations, those, of course, who hadn't already been killed off by disease. So the Spanish rule in the Americas early on, in the early part of the 1500s here, was especially cruel and especially bad. And that's an important point to think about as we go on here in a second with some other stuff, right? The Spanish are dominant in Spanish America, okay? Central and South America is largely controlled by the Spanish, and some areas in the present-day United States. Specifically, in the South, places like Florida, the Spanish had great influence, and in the American Southwest, places like Texas, what becomes Texas, California, New Mexico, Utah, all the way up as far north as like the southern border of Oregon. So the Spanish are quite influential in these regions around the United States of what ultimately becomes the United States of America too. Now what I want to talk about is an important kind of AP concept. Okay, a big thing in AP for you is the idea of causation. C-A-U-S-A-T-I-O-N, causation. Basically, historically, causation is reference to what causes events to happen, what changes in society result in some sort of significant change. And that brings us to the next point, something called the Ordinances of Discovery. And the Ordinances of Discovery is what I like to refer to as super important AP point number 1. Throughout the year, we're going to get what I call super important AP points. What they are points that things that I've seen multiple times on AP exams, so things that you should be particularly aware of as we prepare for the AP exam in May. What the Ordinance of Discovery was basically a ban on the brutal practices of the Spanish, outlawing brutality. These were laws created by Spanish government officials that said, the stuff you're doing is really awful to these people. You're going to have to back off of that, okay? The Ordinances of Discovery, again, ban brutal practices by the Spanish against the native peoples of the Americas, essentially ban these practices against the peoples that they're conquering, okay? And that's a big change, right? That's causation. People are fed up or upset with the brutality that's taking place. So it gives them significant cause to make change. This changes the future of the Spanish influence in the Americas because now, Spanish being a very Catholic country, instead of trying to be greedy and gain more gold and wealth and things like that, instead in the Americas begins focusing their efforts on establishing Catholic missions. You see this influence today very clearly in what used to be Spanish America. Cities like San Antonio starts as a Catholic mission. You know, San Antonio is Saint Anthony, right? Translated. San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, many other cities along the coast in California as well, and other places were Catholic missions created by the Spanish to convert native peoples to Catholicism, which, you know, on the surface seems to be a more noble cause, a more noble effort, but of course at the same time it's also forcing your religion upon another people. In other words, saying that their religion is in some way inferior, and their only means to being saved is to convert to Catholicism. Say about that what you will, but that was the Spanish perspective. Again, here's another map. All the stuff here in yellow is basically controlled largely by the Spanish. So lots of great Spanish influence, not great in a good way, but just lots of it. Lots of influence, and particularly here in Central and South America, and up in what becomes the United States as well. You can see all these little crosses here, different places where they established missions. Okay, so our last little bit here, and I'll go through this really quick. So moving forward to the later part of the Spanish Empire in America. Significant events or significant things that they do. One is establishing northern outposts. It's actually the Spanish that established the first permanent settlement in what would become the United States in St. Augustine, Florida, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is in 1565, so a little bit before the British arrive in the Americas. Is the first permanent settlement in America and what becomes the United States. Santa Fe, New Mexico is also a significant one, and events in Santa Fe and regions around there lead to one of the more significant events in the history of the Spanish in the American Southwest, which is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Okay, so why is this an important event? In 1680, native peoples who were fed up with raids from other tribes, Apache, raiders, decide that they've had it with the Spanish governors that were controlling the region and not taking care of the native peoples that were living there. So they revolt against the Spanish government and overthrow the Spanish government. It's a successful revolt in that sense until about 12 or 16 years later, when the Spanish retake control. That is an important point also to think about, okay? Because it establishes kind of a pattern with what we see with first Europeans and later Americans, the United States, in their relationship with natives. Whenever the native peoples have some sort of small victory, some sort of victory in some sort of revolt, the whites, or the Americans, or the British colonists, whoever it is, ultimately later come back and reestablish control. The slight difference this time is when Spain comes back in 1696, somewhere between 1692 and 1696, and reestablish control of the region. Rather than subjugate these people again, instead they kind of adapt to a policy of what we call assimilation and accommodation. In other words, assimilation is when you force your culture upon another people and they over time adapt to it. Okay? So you have a mixture of that assimilation as well as a little bit of accommodation, meaning you allow for these native peoples to continue their native practices and work alongside the Spanish there. Ultimately, last thing here today, um, what this leads to is a very different relationship between the Spanish and how they deal with native people, Native Americans, and the British. The British seek to subjugate and force their culture and things upon native peoples. Ultimately, the Spanish realize that we need to accommodate them a little bit. So essentially, the relationship between native peoples and the Spanish is a little bit better than the relationship that the British colonists establish with um, with these people. That's all for today. Remember, the Chapter 1 packet will be due on Friday. If you just email that to me or turn it in to Mrs. Metter, and she'll get it to me. Uh, and we'll have the quiz on Friday over Chapter 1. I'll give that to Mrs. Metter for you to take and submit. All right, so anyway, thanks a lot, and that's all.